Can everyone? Okay. So, are you open? Yeah. Okay, let's chin. Okay. More. So just I have maybe I should. Okay. All right. I'll make room. Let's go. All right. Hi, everyone. So, like Lynn said, I'm a journalist by trade. So I'm really glad we're having this conversation because we come at these stories from really different areas of expertise. What drew me to the Delta was also my own family story. So, uh, 10 years ago, I moved down to Cleveland, Mississippi, to start learning about my family's history there. And while I was down there, I came across another story which was far more interesting, compelling, told us a lot more about our nation's history, about the world's history. So I quickly called my editor and I said, I'm not writing the book I'm supposed to write. I'm going to write a different one. And what I did was learn all about the family that brought the first US Supreme Court case to challenge segregation in Southern schools. And it was a Chinese immigrant family that brought this case. So whenever it loads, I'll show you their pictures so you can get to know them. But what I really wanted to do was tell not a story broadly, but deeply about a family and how they make decisions. So at the beginning of the school year, September 15th, 1924, 100 years ago, two young girls. We can go to the picture of them. Yeah. So this is Berta and her sister Martha, who's taller than her but younger than her. That's how it works out in some families. So Berta was about 11 and Martha was 9, and they went to the school that they had always gone to in Rosedale, Mississippi, which is right up the road from where my family was raised for generations and generations. And on that fateful day at the noon lunch hour, they were brought into the office and told that they were no longer considered uh, the right students for that school. They had been attending that school and they were sent from the white school, told that they had to matriculate at the black school. And they went home, and the family and the community made a decision that would change the whole course of history. They didn't know they were making a historic decision. They knew they were making a decision for their family. And so we can go to the next slide just so you all can see the class. So this is the class. This was taken this spring, right before they went into the fall semester. You can see Martha and Berta in front, and just to see the diversity of this class, right? Just I want you to all understand the implications of raising a fight like this, kind of everyone in the school, right? It's not by any means, it's a very diverse school. It's clearly got it. People at that time were from Syria, China. There was all kinds of European immigrants in this community at the time. So when they said, you are no longer welcome at this school, it also threatened the status of every other child at that school. And what they decided to do was fight. First the school board, then the Mississippi Supreme Court, and then eventually the US Supreme Court, which in 1927, we can go to the next slide so you can see the school. In 1927 ruled against the family. It was a broad decision, unanimous decision that said that not only can schools keep Chinese students from attending the white schools, but they also have the ability, the school board, to determine the race of that student. So it's up to the school board to determine the race, which has never been overturned. It's kind of terrifying that that's still lingering out there. But the key person in bringing this fight, the lawyer, if we switch to the next slide, I just want you to all see him. There he is, Earl Brewer, your great-grandfather. And he was a stalwart supporter of the family right up until He did his grand oral argument at the Mississippi Supreme Court. They lost. They filed an appeal, and then he never fought it in the U.S. Supreme Court. And we do wonder what would have happened. He was just a really strong advocate if he had been there. But the case was handed off to a novice who filed on brief, and it was lost. So there was an opportunity that was lost there when he gave up that case. And we still have a lot of questions probably within the family of why he wouldn't choose to argue it. All right, we can go to the next slide. I wanted to put in my perspective as a journalist, right, as telling a story, and then also kind of the debt that you owe to history. So there's just one example. I know this is 1882 Foundation, which 1882 passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act. And in my book, I kind of pull in the stories of people who were shaping history at the time. And one of those people is actually a tabloid writer named Julian Ralph. He wrote for the New York Sun, and he was starting to write about the crossing the Canadian border, right? And at the time, Gong Lum, the father in this case, was crossing the border during that time through Canada. And this magazine article, I mentioned it in the book, and I mention it now because in the wake of this was a mass hysteria in the media about a porous Canadian border. He kind of coined the term illegal immigrant, and that whole motion that was set into place by a long, very inaccurate Harper's Magazine article kind of carved out this spot for what eventually kind of created the rhetoric that was used in the case against the Lum family. So even though we're talking, a generation, right? The seeds of that come, from a culture that is, there are fears being stoked that are based on inaccurate stories. And the ultimate decision by the U.S. Supreme Court is in a climate that has been fed that over and over again. So coming at these from a journalist where you don't always have all of the information, but you want to bring it out there, you're fighting against a current, which is what the journalism was at the time. And that's why it took 6 years to report a book, is because you can't tell the stories always based on what the contemporary reporting was. So we can go to the final picture I think I have in the slide. Is just, I want you to see the faces of the people that did this. Because what they ruled in 1927 was such a devastating blow to all of the immigrant families throughout the American South, who had been attending white school, had been attending for the most part, going to white churches, being a part of white community. And then it just literally overnight kind of changed things. And in a lot of families, which is Susan's work, we'll talk about, and she's followed them more closely than I did. They decided to leave the Delta or to send their children out of Mississippi and into China right when it was on the brink of war. So this is, a time that's really fraught, late 20s, early 30s. There's young children who have been raised in America, and they're being sent back to China to live with relatives and be educated as a result of some of these decisions. So I think that's my last slide there. I may have one more. I don't think that's it for them. Yeah, and I can kind of pass the baton to Susan, because I think part of that larger question, right, is sort of how do we tell these stories, and kind of what weight do we carry when we tell them? And we both have really different, I'm pulling at the threads that can make a good story, right? What makes a good book? And I think there's a much broader picture that you map that I wasn't able to now, where I'm so grateful that you are. So.
Can I have my slide? I need it. It's my notes to remind me what I was going to say. But I'll start by saying that, so my grandmother grew up in Clarksdale, the daughter of Earl Brewer, ex-governor of Mississippi. And so I grew up hearing stories from her about his legal work for the Chinese community. And that I was interested in China as long as I can remember, like from a very young age. So I somewhere in there decided I wanted to be an anthropologist. I got into a PhD program at the University of California, Santa Barbara. I had to pick where in the world I was going to do my research. And China had just opened up to researchers from the US because the US and China restored diplomatic relations in 1979. And in 1981, the first cohort of American researchers was able, through a government to government relationship to actually go in and be allowed to do research. And one of my classmates at Santa Barbara was in that cohort. So I arrived the following year and I'm like, wow, that's so cool. I want to be one of the first people to go into China and do research. So I started studying Chinese in graduate school, and boy, did I wish I had started earlier because that was tough, learning Chinese at the same time I was doing a PhD, in anthropology. So I ended up at Peking University and I joined the track team because I had been a national class athlete in the US. I competed in the 1980 and 1984 Olympic trials, but I was never good enough to make an Olympic team. So, I always thought in the back of my mind, that would be a great way to get to know people and practice my Chinese. And then one thing led to another, and I ended up representing Beijing City in the National College Games and winning a gold medal. So that was like such an incredible experience that I felt like I needed to go with it. And I used it as the topic of my dissertation. And I've been an expert on Chinese sports and Olympic Games ever since. So that's like my real expertise. So I do speak and read Mandarin Chinese, but not any of the dialects that are useful for, these immigrants who spoke generally Toisanese or at least a dialect of Cantonese. And so when I became interested in China, my grandmother gave me the tapestry that is featured in the background here. It's silk with metallic threads. It's very unusual. I've never been able to get anybody to identify exactly anything specific about it. That had been a gift, she was told, or she told me, to Earl Leroy. By the way, it's not Leroy, it's Leroy Brewer. At Christmas time, the Chinese community, representatives of the Chinese community would knock on the door of their mansion and give them gifts. And another gift was lychee nuts. When I learned Mandarin, which is li zhi, I thought that's a mispronunciation. It's lychee, right? Which you can also pronounce lychee. But I was in the Delta, sometime last year, and I said something about my grandmother always said she loved lychee nuts. And I'm like, surely she's like the only white person in the Delta that, likes lychee nuts. But I was talking to a Delton, an old timer, and Gilroy Chow. And he said, and I said lychee nuts, and he said, that's lychee. And so I was like, oh my gosh, she was pronouncing it correctly. Who knew? So that proved to me that yes, she actually must have eaten them and liked them. So she gave me the tapestry, because I had become interested in China. And it's one of the few things we have that was handed down all the way from him, because that's 3 generations above me. And I think that must show that his work for the Chinese meant a lot to him. But actually, I have not been able to find anything in any of the family papers or any records of him about any Chinese people whatsoever. So anyway, but back to how I found Adrienne's book. It was the pandemic. I couldn't go to China. I always thought someday I would research his relationship with the Chinese community. And since I couldn't go to China, I was thinking about doing it then, because I could do the research in the US, when a colleague contacted me who was doing some Chinese American history and said, is this your grandfather? And she sent the name of the case, Gong Lum versus Rice. And I have to say, so one thing we're talking about here is lost histories. I had been by that time a China scholar for like 30 years, and I had never heard of Gong Lum versus Rice. In fact, I knew almost nothing about Chinese American history at all. Because it's not taught along with Chinese history when you specialize in China. So my first reaction was, no, that's not him. But I thought, before I write a snarky email, I should probably Google something. So I Googled him, And this, you don't have it here, the cover of her book that she just showed you came up on a website. And I was like, holy crap. Like, I didn't know. I didn't know he was in, I knew he did the legal work. I didn't know it was like major stuff that went to the Supreme Court. So then I really got piqued. And then, as I said, it's the pandemic. I can't go to China. So I started researching it. So here's now what I've been doing, talking about our process. I did immediately read Adrienne's book. I called her. We had a long conversation. And one thing Adrienne said was she was never really able to sort of figure out the larger picture of networks. And so I thought, I'm an anthropologist, that's a social scientist, that will be interesting to me. And I'm in particular interested in how white people and Chinese people manage to collaborate, on this. So I started out to find, Earl Brewer's life is really well documented. But as I said, I've been through the family collection, the collection in the Mississippi State Archives, I mean, hundreds of pages. And I never even found a mention of a Chinese person. So like, this is really an invisible history. So then I can only sort of extrapolate about his, but I have the tapestry, that says something. So I can only extrapolate, but I started looking at lawyers and legal cases. And that was what led me to find out that Gong Lum versus Rice was just one of 3 related cases that went on for a decade. So it was followed up. So here's Gong Lum versus Rice, Supreme Court decision. So it goes on from 1924 to 27, from local to state to Supreme Court. As soon as it was unsuccessful, because by the way, it was successful at the local level. So the local circuit court judge, who was a good friend of Brewer, said that school, Rosedale, has to let in the Chinese. And then they went to the Mississippi Supreme Court, and as soon as it was overturned there, they filed a second lawsuit, and that was Lund v. Bond. And so that's 1925. And he was another boy, a 17-year-old in Lungzhou. He was a citizen of China, unlike Martha, who was born in the US. And by the way, nobody challenged birthright citizenship in those days. And his father was a citizen of China because he had immigrated only 6 years prior. So they actually used a completely different legal argument based on a treaty, the Burlingame Treaty of 1868, which gave Chinese citizens the same rights as American citizens in the US. And to me, Brewer clearly really knew almost nothing about the Burlingame Treaty because the judge asked him about it in the local court case, which, unlike Lum versus Rice, has a very long transcription. So there was actually a long court trial and a transcript that survived. And when he was asked about it, the judge says, well, if American citizens are in China, can they go to Chinese schools? And he's like, well, actually, I don't know. So that strategy had to come from somebody else, is what I'm thinking. And, so there was a bigger strategy, 2 complementary cases, 2 different strategies. Lund versus Bond goes to same thing, favorable decision from Judge Alcorn, unfavorable decision at the Mississippi State Supreme Court, unfavorable decision at the US Supreme Court, which then also reaffirms Gong Lum versus Rice 2 years later. So that was that. Then I discovered 6 years later, there was a 3rd case, which is really interesting. It shows to me that some white people really cared about these cases, irrespective of what the Chinese people thought, because there were no Chinese people involved in this case at all. And this is white people fighting about the first 2 cases. And basically, it looks like there was a progressive faction in Clarksdale that wanted to segregate the schools, maybe even let Negroes, let Black people into the schools, maybe that would have been the next step. But they certainly wanted Chinese kids in the white schools. But southward in Jackson, and centered on the state government there, there was an attorney general and a faction around him who were opposed. And the attorney general started meddling immediately. And this is what's now clear from this third court case. As soon as Gong Lum versus Rice was in the winds, he's lining up lawyers, and they thought what he did was not only illegal, they thought there was some financial impropriety in the way he paid the lawyer. And the lawyer himself, by the time you get to Lum versus Vaughn, is suspicious because he'd been the assistant attorney general and he resigned to take on these cases, E.C. Sharp. So anyway, the upshot of that is that this goes to the Mississippi State Supreme Court and it loses too. And so in these times, he was, Brewer was maybe ahead of his day, but the times were against him and he just couldn't fight the trend, the racism that was out there. And so for me, one of the lessons here is that, first of all, the Supreme Court is not always on the right side of history or the right side of social justice. And the other thing is, you can have really powerful, wealthy people fighting on your side, as the Chinese did, and you still lose, you just don't always win, frankly. So that's, for me, the lesson out of all of this is just trying to bend the arc of history, no matter how long it takes. All right, so.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brownell. And I think it's really interesting. Both of you, although you're meeting for the first time, demonstrate incredible persistence because, Adrienne, I think most journalists, if they're interested in a topic, don't end up writing an entire book and then connecting with Dr. Brownell. And then Dr. Brownell, I think most people, if they wanted to learn Chinese, don't end up trying to be an Olympic athlete. So that's incredible. I'm going to ask you two one more question, and then I will open up the floor to any questions you have, because this is a very timely topic, so I'm sure all of you have some questions, but I will tee it up with this one. So although neither of you is ethnically Chinese, you both have personal connections with these stories. Adrienne, because your mother grew up in Cleveland, Mississippi, and Susan, because your great-grandfather was the attorney for the Chinese community. And you are a China scholar who speaks Mandarin and has spent years living in China. How do your personal backgrounds shape the way you tell the stories of the Mississippi Delta Chinese? And Susan, how did you feel to read what Adrienne wrote about your own family's story? So who would like to go first? Adrienne, yeah. And this is informal, so you guys are welcome to sit.
Let's see. I think it really, it's coming from the step that we take as a journalist from going from absolute ignorance to trying to understand enough to be able to explain it to a broader public. So my family goes back in this same county that this case took place for, as far as I could trace, like 5 generations. I mean, we were there since the county was there. And I knew nothing of this story. I learned from my grandmother that the Chinese grocery in Cleveland would cash their family's checks on Saturdays. And that was about it. That was how siloed, the culture that she grew up in pre-segregation, during segregation, pre-integration of the schools was. So for me, it was an entire learning experience to learn not just about, the Lum family, but about the culture that my family was literally lived 2 blocks away from the grocery store and did, I don't know this story. So I will say it took a ton of work for the people that helped with the book. Like, I just cannot say enough good things about archivists and just families. I mean, all the families, you mentioned Gilroy and Frida, all of these people that just opened up their lives, their histories, their homes. The Lum family opened up their whole archives. They were sharing letters that some of them had never even seen before with us. So it takes a lot. And I think that the one thing I would impart on anyone that's trying to do something like this is just talk to everyone and talk to them now. We're losing people, and these stories aren't told. Zhugong, he crossed the frozen Detroit River. Just that experience of coming to America. You're crossing a river at night. The only light is a lighthouse that's miles away. And you're in a world that you have on a climate in clothes you've never seen, a language you don't understand, and you're crossing a frozen causeway to get to some place that you've only heard about in, stories, right? Like that experience feels so visceral, and it was hidden from the family completely. We know it happened, but we don't know anything about the exact date. We don't know anything about what his experience was like because no one ever asked him and he never offered it up. So in so many of these stories of immigration or just in family hardship, it's the secret. The case wasn't talked about in the Lum family because they lost. And even though it's an amazing piece of history, it wasn't kept in the same way that other things are, because it's not, at the time it was considered a loss. So I would just I'm constantly telling everyone, just talk to your grandmother, talk to your grandfather, pull out your, phone and record, just keep these histories, because if you don't, no one will. And it may be that a generation from now, a couple of nerds like us are going to want to dig all this stuff up. And if it's not kept and no one asks those questions, then there's no way to recreate it authentically.
Well, obviously, given my life history and also what Brewer did, from the get-go, I was just really interested in the fact that it's white people and Chinese people in the Delta, for heaven's sake, at the heights of the Jim Crow era, working together, and elite white people taking up the cause of the Chinese people, and why, what motivates them, what's in it for them, or whatever. So that's kind of been not only a motivating question, but also I realize there's a bigger point there, because if you think about, say, some of the right-wing conservative criticisms of what they call woke history or, whatever, part of the criticism is that it really focuses on victimization. But what I see from this story is these people were not passive victims at all. They were fighting with every resource they had. And it wasn't just weak, disadvantaged Chinese people. They had powerful, wealthy white people on their side. So for me, that's almost in a way the depressing thing. They were not, in a sense, victims. They were strong, and they had a plan, and they were executing it. And they lost anyway, so that's kind of something that really bothers me. So, but anyway, so that's sort of for me, the interesting dynamic that I would like to try to capture in my work. The other thing I learned is that I had heard about erased history. I had never really encountered it in studying, for example, Chinese history. So, but when I realized how hard it is to research these court cases, and overall just the fight that the Chinese American community put up against the Exclusion Act, because Brewer was not the first top-notch lawyer they hired. They regularly hired top-notch lawyers. They used the courts for years trying to fight the Exclusion Act, and so this is just part of that legacy. And yet this history got erased anyway, because it is really hard you had to use oral history. I'm using kind of obscure court documents. That's been a big, and I'm using immigration files, which are kind of hard to identify, but once you realize how the system works, if you can find the interrogations, if you want to call them that, of the immigrants when they entered the country, and you can mine them, and if you get enough of them, you can triangulate and you can start to put together a bigger picture. So that's how I'm recovering this erased lost history. But, you know, the other side of this is that Brewer himself got erased a bit. If you look at the way he and his record and his biography have been written up in Histories of Mississippi, you can see that he doesn't get credit for all of these fights. And it wasn't just Chinese people. A few years later, he had a really important Supreme Court case that he finally won, which was defending 3 Black men accused who were sentenced to death for a murder based on confessions extracted by torture. So that went to the Supreme Court and he finally won that. And that is it's generally, I mean, law students know it's an important case in the history of the fact that you can't be forced to testify against yourself. So there was that. But, you know, Histories of Mississippi, they don't really say any of that. So it's not just disadvantaged Chinese people who can't speak English very well. You've got again, an elite white man who got erased. So that's how bad it is. So this is all new to me, and I'm just appalled, you know. So I want to do something about it. I want to teach it in the schools. But so I would like to say, because I have written about Chinese people, and so I know what it's like to write about somebody, and then you meet somebody that you wrote about, and you know, and I'm always gratified when they say to me, it seems accurate, like it reflects my experience, it's true to my experience, and like, good job, you know. And that's actually what I felt, you know, when I read her description of Brewer, which told me more about him than I ever knew. And to see her bring him to life as a real person, like with a little bit eccentric and, you know, with long curly hair that went down, you know, below his collar line and all of this stuff, and nothing really that seemed off, which is hard when you're recreating somebody from limited sources. Like, no, you know, the picture generally seemed pretty right. So, I mean, I would say that's how I felt reading her account of Brewer.
Thank you so much. So I'd like to open the floor up to any questions that any of you have, and we do have a Zoom audience. So I'm looking at my phone because I'm getting messages about those questions. But, oh, yes, the beautiful teal in the front.
Well, actually, I have one comment and I have one question, and both of them are speculative in nature. Coming back to that third case, I can very easily imagine that the whites were intent on using the Chinese as the thin edge of the wedge, because this was also the era of Plessy versus Ferguson. Separate is equal. And there was a large influx of people from Mexico because of the Mexican dictatorship during this period. And those Mexicans, originally Latino people, were classified as white. And it's only later that you get this kind of racial imposition, this kind of color imposition. So I can imagine them seeing that as literally the thin edge.
I actually think you're right. I've only got very limited evidence for that, but I agree. I'll continue to try to find more evidence.
And the second question, perhaps you can answer this better than Susan can, since you know her great grandfather so well. He served as governor. For me, as a political scientist, the question is, why didn't he decide to run again? Whereas governor of the state of Mississippi, he could have had more control over the educational system, at least, you know, after having lost this case, to kind of go back into politics, because we know what Youngkin is doing to education in Virginia, and, you know, all these kinds of things happening. So was there any intimation that he was fed up with politics?
No, they were fed up with him. He took this case immediately following a failed Senate run. He tried to get back into politics pretty quickly, and he was shut out completely. So, I mean, even his local paper, which your grandmother wound up working for, had a scathing piece about, you know, he can't even win his home county. What a disgrace to the state. He thinks he can take up all these progressive issues. Well, we'll show him. So not only was he struggling with his political reputation, but financially, he was also really struggling at the time. So that was the other part for me was, you know, it was such a risk, but he had nothing left to lose. You know, if you've got really no reputation left in terms of trying to run and make a difference in the state, you've got no finances, then what the heck? Why not try to, you know, take up this fight? One thing that I looked for when I first started reporting this out was, because I knew they were relevant at the time for some cases, and Brewer would eventually take cases for the NAACP. I thought, you know, naive as that I was at the time, well, maybe there was this coalition, right? And there was a way to kind of, if this Chinese family was able to kind of crumble this wall of segregation, then maybe there would be a way to integrate the schools in this community, and that the Black community got involved, and that they were all like, everybody was working together. The opposite of what was going on. But it is something that I think is probably the most fascinating part of Brewer to me, is that he went on, he took this case, and then he drops this case, he takes on an anti-lynching case, and then he goes on to do a series of cases for the rest of his career for the NAACP. So, I mean, he just, to his core, he was a fighter and fighting against the currents of Mississippi at the time, of Mississippi now in some places, right? So he really was an incredible person. I would love to see if maybe that can be your next project, a full biography of him. Because you know, what's there in the State House said nothing about the man that he was. He really was an amazing person.
It was really gratifying to hear her describe him as a hero. And another book has been written about the 3 Black men, the Kemper County trio, and that author described him as a hero too. And I actually have gotten into the NAACP records, trying to find if they cared at all about Gong Lum versus Rice. But they didn't even have a Mississippi chapter then. It wasn't until a bit later that the NAACP got systematized in Mississippi. But, you know, I went through them for years, the Mississippi records, and they just didn't seem to care about the Chinese. They just weren't on the map of the NAACP in Mississippi in this time period.
How big was the Chinese community at that time?
About 300 is what the James Lowen says in the Delta. Not all, well, they were mostly focused in the Delta. But.
Good questions. I have one from the audience online. This one is, did the Tate versus Hurley case in California have any influence in the court case in the South? Who can start with that question?
There's a fantastic book on Mamie Tate. It's called The Lucky Ones. It follows multiple generations of that family. That's one of the best books I've ever written about this. It's better than mine. It's a very, very good book. I thought about that a lot in this book, and I think it's not used in any of the language. It's not cited. I think it was really separate worlds. You know, California was a whole different world than what Mississippi was going through at the time. So just because the structure of segregation in Mississippi was in so much of the law that it was like codified in a way that I think there was a little more wiggle room with the Tate case. But yeah, I was expecting to see more of that at play in the case, and I didn't. But, you know, it could have been that Brewer was wholly unfamiliar with it. I mean, the thing about Mississippi is everything's so local. Every family has been there for generations, and it's all of these white people that are fighting each other in the third case have been fighting each other for 3 or 4 generations. So it's really kind of unique. And I will say with the Lum family, they gave up after the 1925 the state Supreme Court decision. So for a lot of families in the Mississippi Delta, the Chinese American families, when that ruling came down, that was when the case ended. And you even see in the oral histories, everyone dates it back to 1925 because they knew, you know, once it's decided in Mississippi, that's the decision. And then it took a couple of years to get the the US Supreme Court, but everyone saw what came down in Mississippi and just assumed that that's what was gonna stand, so.
But you pointed out in your book, there was something really important, and maybe that came from Brewer. You can only appeal a case to the Supreme Court if it involves federal laws that the Supreme Court has purview over. And I think TAPE had ended at the California State Court because they had, maybe that's a strategic error, but in any case, they could not appeal it to the Supreme Court. They hadn't constructed it properly. But Gong Lum versus Rice was constructed with 14th and 15th violations of the 14th and 15th Amendments. So that's how that got to the Supreme Court. And then, interestingly, the Supreme Court hears treaties. So Lund versus Bond not only cited 14th and 15th Amendment violations, but also the violation of the Burlingame Treaty. So they had like 3 different reasons that they could appeal it to the Supreme Court. And by the way, the Chinese people in some ways were more cosmopolitan than the white people, because as I've gotten hold of their immigration records and reconstructed that community, they traveled frequently back and forth to China, like every 3 to 5 years. They were merchants, so they could do that during the exclusion era, and apparently they had the wealth to do it. And they had San Francisco connections. A fair number of them had started out like Hinlin Zhou's father had first, I mean, he was supposedly a wealthy merchant. He was in Hong Kong for a while working for a leather and hides import firm. And he supposedly came to the US in 1915 for the Pan-Pacific Exposition in San Francisco to develop the leather and hides, import-export market. And so then he came from there to the Delta. So, I mean, these people are actually more cosmopolitan than Brewer, because as far as we know, he went to England once in his life. Like that was the only time he crossed an ocean, as far as we know.
Yes, question.
First of all, this is great. I mean, this is just amazing to hear and to learn about. So I had a question about, given the time today, with the politics of today and the way the law works today, are there any lessons from this for today?
I'm just going to repeat that question for our virtual audience. So given the political climate today, the way the law works, are there lessons that we can draw on history for today?
I mean, I can just give a short answer to that, since I'm really interested in the court cases and the lawyers, and I'm like, they matter. They actually, like a lot of the description of Gong Lum versus Rice that you see out there on the internet or whatever, I mean, maybe even at the Chinese History Museum here, doesn't even mention the lawyers, right? But I've realized that actually they're really important, so I think you can fight racism and discrimination you should always fight it on whatever levels you can, but the courts and the legal system, like, don't forget them. That should always be a central part. You may not win right away, but just don't give up.
We have a question online. What is the significance of the title of your book, Adrienne, Water Tossing Boulders?
Oh yeah, good question. Okay, I'll read it. It's from The Art of War. When torrential water tosses boulders, it is because of its momentum. So the idea, right? I think that ties to your question too. It's a drop that becomes a river, that becomes a waterfall that can move a boulder. So you start with a drop. And this family, they may have not been successful, right? But they started a fight, which this is later cited in Brown v. Board. So you have it, you got to get that drop going to make the stream, to make the river, to move the boulder. It can't just be, immediate waterfall, boulder goes over. There's going to be a battery of cases that we're going to see fought again and again and again and again and again. And, like this one, and, they were fighting year after year, trying to fight. And that's what it takes. It's not going to be you know, an instantaneous, nothing happens quickly. It's always that one drop and you just have to see that drop. And we've been here before, we will be here again, and it's just gonna take people who are brave enough to go up against, you know, the tides of history.
You know, I really appreciated that title because it references a Chinese proverb, 水滴穿石, drops of water bore through stone. And that meaning meant a lot to me because I worked with a high Chinese official who had spent years trying to get China back into the Olympic Games when they were excluded, you know, the whole embargo over China after the Communist Revolution. That was his favorite saying, you know, and now you look at China today, world superpower in sport, right? 30, 40 years. So, you know, yeah, the drops of water eventually bored holes through the stone.
Any questions? Yes, right there.
You mentioned that your research used a lot of conversations, oral histories, talking with families, descendants, and so forth. And given Berta and Martha, right? You know, when you're a kid, you don't have time to wait for these darn court cases. You need to get to third grade, fourth grade, fifth grade. And so not only this family, but how other families were impacted. Did you get a sense of, you know, what were the options open to these families for continuing to educate their children? Send them to New York or a relative in San Francisco, or send them to China, which to me seems like a very, you know, challenging environment for these little kids on their own. But, you know, what did people do?
Yeah, that's what they did. It's amazing, some of the letters that were back, you know, between mothers talking about what it was like to have their children in China at that time. But that's what happened. And Memphis, Houston, New York, the Lum family, they sent their kids to, well, your direction. They were up in outside Detroit. So yeah, it's every family made a different calculus. What is interesting to me is none of the families decided to send their children to the black schools. So, or even tried to work to improve the black schools if they knew their kids would have to go there. So that structure, this kind of binary racial society, if you can do whatever you can to stay on the white side of that track, then that's what those families were doing, even if it meant sending their children to China on the brink of war. So shortly after, so in I want to say 1933, I don't know if you came across this, was the construction of the Cleveland Chinese school. So they actually developed their own school. They converted a church and had their own school. It's either 1930 or 1933.
I'm thinking 33.
Okay, yeah. So that did happen where they constructed their own church school that was formed out of the kind of like abandoned church. And that operated for a long time. I want to say like 15, 20 years. And there's people alive today who attended that school. So
And that was part of the public school system.
and that was their own kind of version. Yeah, it was. I think it was church funded.
I think it was church, right?
Yeah,
It's
it wasn't
largely
part of public.
Baptist, but actually I discovered the Presbyterian and maybe Methodist churches were all in on it in the beginning. And then maybe the Baptist church sort of took over. Because today, most of the Delta Chinese are pretty devout Baptists. And that's part of the reason why.
The schools would have followed the standard curriculum and so forth, so on. And it wasn't anything like what we have now as the Chinese language schools, you know, after school stuff for
No,
kids.
they told a teacher from the public school and paid her better than she was making at the public school to teach at that school. So they were learning the kind of state curriculum
Yes, right.
alongside their white peers and their black peers. So it was yeah. And then, you know, World War II happens and that changes the whole calculus of everything. There's a lot we could go into without time, but there was a brief window there where they kind of did have separate but equal education and that they had their own school.
And the trivia point, not trivia, a very interesting point about Yilin Zhang, so the boy, grew up, got married, moved his family to Houston, as a lot of them did, because there were more economic opportunities there and the segregation was not quite as bad. So his daughter, Josephine Ju, grew up in Houston, went to the University of Houston, and became the first Chinese American woman hired by NASA, established their machine learning department back in the day, and is quite well known, like as they call her, the other hidden figure at NASA. So he only ever had a third grade education, really, because he had some education in China and then almost none in the US. And so, you think about the incredible social mobility from him to her. And she's still alive, and I've gotten to know her, which is kind of incredible to know somebody whose father knew my great-grandfather.
That means Catholic schools in Mississippi were equally segregated?
Catholic? They didn't have Catholics.
No, you are Baptist or Presbyterian.
All right, we'll take one more audience question here, and then I have a question on Zoom. And then we'll go into our happy hour networking. So you are welcome to ask more questions, but would anyone like to pose a question to the floor? Well, while you're thinking, the question from Zoom is, was Brewer working pro bono for the Chinese family?
Oh, no, he definitely wasn't. He never worked pro bono, even for the Kemper County trio. Like, the archives for that case consist of all these letters about the money. And he says, I will do it without attorney's fees, but you have to pay my expenses. So even for this case that he felt so strongly about. So we don't have letters like that for the Chinese cases, but we have, my grandmother always told me that he was paid by a statewide association. And I did discover letters in the Supreme Court archives written by J.K. Young, whose picture was up a moment ago. And the letterhead is the United Chinese Merchants Association, Tennessee, Arkansas, Mississippi. And I've been able to establish that that was an association founded and chartered in Memphis in 1920, actually an association with a big shebang in Memphis, which they were going to try to promote the silk trade in this big, meeting. And, the mayor and everybody were there. So I'm thinking, because as Adrienne noted, like, why did he take on the case? I posed that to some cynic who said he's a lawyer, he did it for the money. But he really did need the money at that time because, first of all, there'd been a cotton crash in Mississippi, and he hit all the wealthy planters, which he also planted cotton on the side, had lost money. But the other thing is, he was being persecuted by his political enemies who were filing lawsuits against him nonstop. I mean, when we look at the Supreme Court date for Lum versus Rice, why wasn't he there? We don't know why he backed out and disappeared. But I mean, there were like 3 different court cases against him going on in that time period, which were described as political persecution by the Jackson newspaper at the time. And he really needed the money. I mean, some of his enemies were trying to force him into involuntary bankruptcy. Like, who knew that was a thing? So I'm thinking these merchants paid him, if not a lot, I think they probably certainly paid his attorney fees, and maybe, I mean, certainly paid his expenses, but maybe attorney's fees on top of that. That would be my guess.
Yeah, and I know, like, the Lum family never paid him out of their pocket. So I think when I was working on the book, it was like, well, they didn't pay him, but we couldn't figure out who exactly did or how much. But J.K. Young seems to be, anyone has any information, he seems like he's a very pivotal person. And
Yeah.
we both kind of got so far on his trail, and then it stopped. So we'd love to learn more about him and the role that he played, because he was really instrumental in helping Zhugang come to the United States. So he served a pivotal role in that place at that time. We just don't know exactly how he did what he did.
And as Adrienne said, my grandmother had become the court reporter actually for the Clarksdale paper in this time period. And so she might have, I don't know, she might have even written some of the blurbs about these two cases, but she did that because she had to work, like her father had told her and her sister, you got to work.
So if anyone would like to write a book on Susan's great grandmother, then we'll have another talk story on that. Any questions from the audience here? Okay, so we actually just have another quick question online. Is anyone writing Josephine's story, the other hidden figures that you mentioned?
No, I wish Adrienne would maybe, I'm like, hey, because she could do, I don't really want to do an oral history of one family. I'm a social scientist. I'm more interested in the group dynamic. So like that one's waiting. Unfortunately, I just don't think there are the sources that Adrienne had for the Gong Lum story, because Joseph, talking about lost history, Josephine didn't even know. Like when I contacted her, she had no idea that her father had been involved in a Supreme Court case. In fact, she told me, I don't know anything about my father at all. So when I was able to find these really detailed immigration records, I mean, it was like amazing. She's, you know, in her 80s, and she went from knowing nothing to having like a really detailed description of their wedding, because that was in the interrogation, because they wanted to ensure that they were actually legitimately married before she came in later, right? So, you know, they have to prove that she's a wife and not a prostitute, which is what they always suspected. So anyway, beside the immigration records, there's like almost nothing, and no family record of the court case, no memory, not just nothing.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. So if you would like to read more of Adrienne's book, Water Tossing Boulders, they're in the back for purchase. And yep, Ted is holding it up. So just find Ted, and then Adrienne will be there too. And if anyone would like to hear more about Susan's work, she'll be at the Memphis Rural Chinatowns Conference from October 15th to 17th. So registration is still open. We just extended the early bird registration to mid-September. So if you would like to meet with scholars, community members, locals, that's the place to be in October. And we're going to stick around for the next 25 minutes or so. So we have cheese and crackers, some refreshments, basically water when I say refreshments, but please stick around and join us for other events. You'll be able to find us on 1882foundation.org. Ted, do you have a couple words? Yeah.
Thank you all for coming. One of the great things about the in-person gatherings here is actually the after event socializing. Gives you a chance to talk one-on-one with people, be a little bit shy and also talk to people, get a book over there, spread out, but we're trying to use our space a bit better than we have in the past. It's always been the socializing hour that has been one of the great things about these talk story events. The talk story events, that's the core of what 1882 is about. We tell our stories, we gather together to tell stories, because it's in the telling of the stories that we remember, and we share, and that makes our community. I just wanted to add one comment though, is that the idea of the descendant not knowing anything until you start searching. One of the more famous characters or personalities we have in our Chinese American experience is that of Wong Kim Ark, who is the one who established the 14th, 15th Amendment for birthright citizenship. You cannot think of a more important finding than that. I remember when I was working in immigration and was talking with the the National Archives people in San Bruno. And the guy over there, one of the head people, called me up and says, "Hey, Ted, this woman is coming in to talk about her grandfather, great-grandfather's records." It was Wong Kim Ark's granddaughter or great-granddaughter. And just when she came in, she had no idea who her grandfather was or the significance, not until they came to San Bruno National Archives and the whole office had stopped work to celebrate her coming in and open up all the wonky mark files. And if you know immigration laws, there are tons of these things because of what Susan was talking about, the comparison. And she did not know until at that very moment. She always thought that her father, great-grandfather was somebody that went back to China, didn't know anything. So find those stories, like Susan was saying, and I know a lot of people, chat with your relative. You may find something very surprising that you don't know. It again, is the telling of the stories that is what 1882 is about. Finding the stories, sharing the stories, and that makes our community. Learning so much from you, Susan. So each of you involved is so thank you very much.
Yes.
Enjoy, just chat with people if you can. Have some few minutes, just share a story. And if you do want to come talk story, talk to Yilin, myself, or someone here, and we'll line you up. We'll
So
give you a-
let's get a huge round of applause for Teresa. Neither of them live in DC. Adrienne, you drove like 3 hours to be here today, and Susan flew from St. Louis, and you brought your sister from Texas. So thank you so much.
Joyce putting her up.
Thank you, Joyce. So clearly you're the best host. We'll just stay with you next time too. So please enjoy, everyone. Please stick around and talk to all of us. And of course, want to thank Ted, our executive director, Amy, who keeps everything going and does an amazing job, Ellen, who has been managing all of our audience online and here too. So thank you to the team and thank you everyone for being here. So please stick around. Yeah, thank you.